Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Sorry for the delay, technical problems. Tonight, we'd like to talk specifically about Zimbabwe's opportunity to have meaningful, free, fair, and credible elections. And to focus specifically on why the Zimbabweans themselves are failing to deliver that. I've been trying to discuss it on various medias and social media, and one of the problems you keep having is people who seem to be incapable of appreciating what we are talking about when we say free, fair, and credible election. The quotation I've got on the page on the page there is stop blaming Chamisa. In this particular case, the individual was responding to a video which I had done in which I was talking of how MDC Triple C leaders failed to implement even one token reform during the GNU when they had the golden opportunity to do so, and how Chamisa specifically lied about implementing democratic reforms last year to entice people to participate in what was clearly flawed elections, only to give ZANU-PF legitimacy. This issue of blaming Chamisa, it clearly shows that here is somebody who really doesn't understand. Because to me, blame implies two things. First of all, that somebody did nothing wrong, at best, and at worst, that it wasn't his fault. How anyone can say failing to implement democratic reforms, even one token democratic reform in 24 years, is not somebody's fault, beggars belief. Ben, what is the problem with Zimbabweans?
Thank you very much for having me on the show, and good evening to our viewers. It's sad, really, to say, it's sad and very, very disappointing to say, 24 years in, I won't talk about the whole 44 years of Zimbabwe's independence. Let's talk about when, MDC started. 24 years in, we are still at this stage. It's very, very, disheartening. Let's go to the basics. The name says, when it was formed, the name says or suggests the movement for democratic change. We're talking, about, moving from the current system or the current environment that we are in. We know that Zimbabwe is a failed state. We are failing to hold free, fair, and credible elections. There is no democracy in Zimbabwe. And we have MDC come along in 1999, and it suggested that it is the alternative to ZANU-PF. It's going to create that democratic space. And 24 years in, like you said, they haven't even created any possible or any tangible, movement towards that, achieving democracy. It's disheartening why people cannot see this. And let me remind you, MDC was never formed to become a government. MDC was to implement reforms, was to fight for reforms. They changed later because of popularity. They changed their mandate because of, they saw that, we can actually become a government. And from there, they have since lost the cause. They have since lost their purpose. And why people cannot see this after 24 years is, it's very, very disappointing. I mean, okay, fine. Let's just go back last year. It proved beyond reasonable doubt what we were saying to say ZANU PF is going to rig these elections. And people were posting, the masses that Chamisa has and all, missing the point again. It's very, very disappointing.
Well, come back to the issue that I was specifically referring to there. Let's make it very abundantly clear. When people say Chamisa and company failed to implement even one token reform, to pretend that he cannot be held to account for that is to miss the point completely. People risked lives, livelihoods, and limbs to elect the opposition for the principal primary purpose of implementing the democratic reforms. And they failed to implement even one token reform. Why? Because Mugabe bribed them with the tokens of high office and they forgot about reforms. So how anyone can say, oh, it wasn't their fault? Beggars belief. You clearly haven't understood a goddamn thing all along. And to come to the second point, Chamisa last year told people that he had plugged all the vote rigging loopholes to stop ZANU-PF rigging the elections. Only the very naive would pretend that he did not know that that was not true. Yeah, of course he knew it wasn't true. Because groups like Team Pachedu had made it very clear that the voters' roll was in shambles. So how can you say you've plugged all the vote rigging loopholes when you know the voters' roll is in shambles? Tim Pachedu went on further to reveal that in last year's elections, Nelson Chamisa and company failed to deploy election agencies at about 1,000 polling stations compared to the total of 11,000 polling stations. So 10% of the polling stations, he did not deploy any election agencies. Why? Make us believe. Because the truth of the matter is, he had been given the money, the funds to pay for those election agencies. So here we are. Here is somebody who claims that I've plugged all the vote rigging loopholes. And then turns out that he didn't even do some of the most basic thing, deploying election agencies at polling stations. And then the people themselves, who are the main focus of this discussion today, continue to pretend that it wasn't his fault. How can it not be his fault? He had the election agencies, he had the money. Why didn't he deploy them? Of course, he knew what he was doing. And that is at the heart of the problem with our Zimbabwean elections. We are failing to accept the tough realities.
Just to add, to say, after every Zimbabwean election, you know, the observer mission, you know, different observer missions would be in Zimbabwe, and they give statements after and findings after every, the whole procedure. You know, every time they give recommendations, and these recommendations are exactly the same. In 2018, the European Union gave up to uh, 23, if I'm not mistaken, recommendations. This past election, SADC gave recommendations as well. AU gave recommendations as well. These recommendations are just the same as reforms. So, we cannot say that SADC is not helping Zimbabwe. SADC is helping Zimbabwe by giving you ways for you to achieve democracy. But you will find out that after all these elections, no one will talk about those recommendations, including the opposition. They just become, numb towards those. And then you fail to find, how then do you expect to have free, fair, and credible elections when these recommendations that you are being given are the way to achieving that? So without those recommendations, how then do you expect to even win? Because these recommendations are not to help ZANU PF. These recommendations are there to actually even help the Chamisa, camp. Because they are the ones that are crying at the end of the day, that the democratic space is not available. So if you are not going to do anything about it after being given, then who do you expect? Because ZANU PF is not going to do that. ZANU PF implementing those reforms or those recommendations is actually shrinking their grip on power. How people will not understand this part and just understand the fact that ZANU PF has been denied legitimacy beggars belief, because you have to understand why they were denied legitimacy. It is stated within the report. And within the report are the recommendations, the reforms that you need to implement for you to have free, fair, and credible elections. Period. So this whole to say, forget about these recommendations. I have my own strategies. Then after your strategies don't work, don't go crying foul to SADC. Don't go crying foul to the AU because you refused.
I was just going to talk to another quotation here from one of the other uh, guys on social media. I'll just focus on the last bit, that with or without reforms, let's find ways of penetrating the system and win power. This is at the heart of the problem. To start with, there's this illusion that we have had reforms and we failed to win power. The truth of the matter is we have never had any reforms. That is the point. We've been talking about here that ever since independence in 1980, ZANU-PF has rigged elections. The first elections in 1980, ZANU-PF was supposed to withdraw its operatives from the field, and yet it kept them. And they were given the instructions. Their campaign message to the people was that if ZANU-PF does not win the election, the Bush war would continue. Of course, the people voted to end the Bush war. And who could blame them? And ever since ZANU-PF got its legs under the desk, it has created a de facto one-party state. The opposition, MDC particularly, were elected for the primary purpose of implementing the democratic reforms designed to stop ZANU-PF rigging the elections. And as I've said earlier on, they failed to implement even one reform. So for somebody to be saying with or without reforms, we have not had any reforms, period. And so far, we have had 44 years of ZANU-PF rigging the elections, albeit the last 24 was with the help or connivance of MDC CCC. The great scientist Albert Einstein said that insanity is repeating the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. We have participated in these flawed elections for the last 44 years, expecting the opposition to win. How naive is that? How insane is that? And yet here we are. Some people are still hell-bent on participating in 2028 elections without even a single token reform implemented, because they believe the idiotic lies that Chamisa and company tell them, that even without reforms, the opposition can win. The problem with Zimbabwe is that we have got an incredibly ignorant and naive electorate. To be fair to the people, they've never been given a chance, because I do not think that Zimbabweans are any different from our friends across the border in Botswana or South Africa, for instance. We have a healthy and functioning democracy, and they've been holding free, fair, and credible elections for a long time. It's just that in our case, the electorate have never been given that chance, both by ZANU-PF and the opposition. Our biggest problem is the ordinary people themselves have not realized that both ZANU-PF and the opposition are exploiting their ignorance to keep on believing that we can win rigged elections. At the heart of it is the problem that we really do not appreciate what constitutes free, fair, and credible elections. And for somebody in this day and age to fail to appreciate what constitutes free, fair, and credible elections is unforgivable, particularly the so-called intellectuals, those in the urban centers who are being conned by Chamisa and company to believe these idiotic lies that the opposition can win rigged elections. We are our own worst enemy. We, Zimbabweans, and nobody else. And if we are serious about ending the ZANU-PF dictatorship, we are not going to get that by getting ZANU-PF to implement reforms. We are not going to get that by getting the opposition, Chamisa and company, to implement reforms. They had the golden opportunity to do so, they failed to do so during the GNU. And right now, they are participating in these flawed elections, conning us ordinary Zimbabweans to participate only to give ZANU-PF legitimacy. That is what we've got to wake up to. And being naive and gullible to that is our greatest weakness. And until we overcome that, Zimbabwe is doomed.
You know, when somebody says with or without reforms, I've actually even heard Chamisa say that, we are going to win big regardless of whatever circumstances are there. This utterance, it for me, when I translate it, it says, it doesn't matter whether ZANU PF rigs or not, we are going to win. And once you have said such an utterance, don't go crying foul when ZANU PF does what it does best, which is rig elections, because you have signed up for it. You have accepted to go into an election that you know very well, because everybody knows, even outsiders, even SADC knows, ZANU-PF rigs elections. This is why they give recommendations to fix that. And we are saying, with or without, we don't mind. So in actual words, we are saying, to hell with the reforms, we will go in as it is. And when we get battered by ZANU-PF, let us not then go crying foul to SADC, blaming them for allowing ZANU. No, 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 no. SADC has given recommendations every single election. The AU has given recommendations every single election. Fix this. Then you can have democratic space. Then you can have a chance to win. But nay, we have decided to go about it the hard way. And we have practically given them the middle finger to say, stay out of our business. We know best. So let's not go back and start crying and blaming them when we have failed ourselves, when we have agreed to participate in rigged elections, knowing fully well 24 years of doing the same thing, and we have not gotten any closer to achieving democracy through the likes of MDC CCC. So if one chooses to say, with or without reforms, well, you've made a bed of thorns. Lie in it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Benjamin. I think I'll just give Professor Lumumba the last say on this issue.
Idiots who don't want to participate in the affairs of their nation, they think things will just work in and of themselves. Then they are tribalists. And these tribalists, they think that they are only safe with people who are from their tribe. And tribe can mean people from the same culture, same language, or same culture. Then they are citizens. These are individuals who are responsible and know that when you want to be served, you must give those who have the desire and the intellectual capacity to serve you. In many societies, it is only a small percentage of people that can be called citizens, not more than 5%. And if a society wants to grow in the right direction, civic education is what will help the idiot and the tribalist to become a citizen.
In the case of Zimbabwe, as much as one can try to educate, and let's face it, ZANU-PF has no intention of educating the ordinary Zimbabwean, nor does MDC Triple C. They are exploiting the ignorance of the people. The people themselves have got to realize, to wake up to the reality that the present system is not working. For one, I'm disappointed at the sheer mentality of some of our people. There are people who refuse to accept that Chamisa lied when he said they had plugged all the vote-raking loopholes, as if by refusing they can change the reality. They're not changing the reality. Chamisa did lie. Chamisa did con millions of Zimbabweans to participate in flawed elections only to give ZANU-PF legitimacy and perpetuate the dictatorship. That is the challenge that we are facing in Zimbabwe today. We should do something about it. But to do that, we have to open our eyes. We have to stop having this mentality of an idiot or a tribesman, as Professor Lumumba was referring to. Think about it. Thank you very much for joining us today. And thank you very much, Benjamin, for helping with this discussion. And good night to everybody.
Thank you. Good night.